Good morning, Shindo here. Today I will be discussing the autobiography, Trump, The Art of the Deal. Trump wrote this with someone named Tony Schwartz. This was published in 1987, long before Trump ran for president, and I felt that reading this would give me some insight into the man, and it certainly did. What strikes me as very interesting is none of his detractors or supporters seem to have read this book, despite the fact that it was a bestseller, and despite the fact that it is his first book. This man is used to controlling the narrative about himself. Lately, of course, he's been having some problems on his campaign, but he is used to controlling this narrative about himself. And certainly that is reflective in the book. But despite that, there are things in this book that if you're reading it with critical thinking skills, you can see exactly what kind of dictator this man wants to be. Folks, a president as dictator is nothing new. You may think this idea is a foreign concept, that it's unprecedented for a president to take dictatorial, king-like powers. It's not. Abraham Lincoln did it. Andrew Jackson did it. A number of presidents have done it to smaller degrees and larger degrees. And when he becomes president, and I feel it's a win, looking at the kind of people that make up this country, it's no surprise to me, it will be no surprise to me, when this man, who wants to take dictatorial powers, and who openly says that he's going to do things like torture, it will be no surprise to me at all when this man becomes president. And when he becomes president, it's a good idea to know what kind of man this man is. Go to the source. Before I get into the book, I want to discuss what my next video is going to be. This heavy metal magazine from 1990 predicted what a Trump dictatorship would be like. In my next video, I'm going to be discussing frame by frame the cartoon about Donald Trump in this heavy metal magazine. It's very interesting. It's very prophetic, and it's full of all kinds of allegory as to what's going on with Trump today. Now, getting back to the book, Trump, The Art of the Deal, published in 1987. So this reflects the way that Donald Trump thought, which is not much different than today, in 1987. I think, however, you'll be very surprised at some of what Trump says. And if you fundies would actually take the time to read this book, you fundamentalist Christians, you might actually realize that Trump is by far not a fundamentalist Christian, and he has no concept of Christianity. Remember, he wasn't running for president then, so the things he said back then would be his actual feelings about certain things, like, for instance, homosexuals, like, for instance, gambling, things that fundamentalists are very staunchly against. In the first chapter of the book, Trump discussed the different deals that he's doing over the course of a week. It's very tedious, quite frankly, and it doesn't read like the rest of the book. I believe that he had no help with the beginning of the book. That's all Trump. It gets better come chapter 2. Trump's father started off as just a regular working class stiff and he was very intelligent and was far from lazy, and he worked his way to make the money that he did. Now, Trump himself is intelligent, and he's far from lazy. He also, of course, had all the advantages of growing up with money. He acknowledges his parents and their contribution to him in growing up. He actually even dedicated the book to them. I think most of you already know that his father was a self-made man and that Trump was born with a silver spoon in his mouth thanks to his father and how hard he worked. So I'm not going to get into his parents. I will, to start with, mention another member of his family. Trump had an older brother named Freddie who wasn't quite involved in the same thing that Trump and his father was. He was somewhat of a disappointment to his father and to Trump as well. Now, this is the large print version that I got out of the library, so these page numbers are not going to be the same as in a regular print version. But starting on page 69, at the very bottom of the page, speaking about his brother, Freddie. He also loved fishing and boating. Freddie was probably happiest during the period in his life, and yet I can remember saying to him, even though I was 8 years younger, quote, Come on, Freddie, what are you doing? You're wasting your time, unquote. I regret now that I ever said that. Perhaps I was just too young to realize that it was irrelevant what my father or I thought about what Freddie was doing. What mattered was that he enjoyed it. Along the way, I think Freddie became discouraged, and he started to drink, and that led to a downward spiral. At the age of 43, he died. It is very sad because he was a wonderful guy who never quite found himself. In many ways, he had it all, but the pressures of our particular family were not for him. I only wish I had realized this sooner. So, a tragic death at a very young age, doesn't say how he died, but a tragic death at a very young age of his brother, his older brother, who was basically pushed into drinking because the man just wasn't as driven as Donald Trump and his father. A few of the other things that I found out about Trump and his childhood and his early youth. In second grade, Trump punched his music teacher in the eye and gave him a black eye, so he's had that temper for some time. In 1964, Trump considered going to film school briefly after he graduated from high school. But instead he went to Fordham University, a 2-year college that is ran by Jesuits. His mother was Scottish by birth. And here on page 86 we have another reflection of how Trump is and how he would be as a president. Page 86. My philosophy has always been that if you ever catch someone stealing, you have to go after him very hard, even if it costs you 10 times more than he stole. I think this personality is something we've already seen when it comes to stealing, when it comes to anything. He is someone who feels very strongly about punishing those who have done wrong. He mentions in here as well that he's not much of a drinker. He doesn't drink at all, which I don't find surprising. But I'll tell you, that is more reflective of just about anything else I read in this book, the fact that he doesn't drink. Why is that? Because when you don't drink and you don't use drugs, which I don't believe he uses drugs either, when you don't drink, you don't do drugs, you don't have that outlet that that you use to make yourself calm in that manner, you tend to be very driven in other matters. The reason he called this the art of the deal is because he's got plenty of money. Except he enjoys doing this just for kicks. And I honestly believe that he, just as back in 2012, he decided to run for president just for kicks. And now he's in a position where he can actually be president. In this past week, in his answers to questions, it's obvious he hadn't really considered the idea that he would actually be president. Now that it's a very real possibility, he has to actually start answering questions about different aspects of what his platform would be. This, for you Christians who believe that Donald Trump is a good Christian, I'm going to read from page 100. Now, of course, I have no problem with homosexuals or gays, but this in 1987, which was hardly a very progressive year, Ronald Reagan was still president. This is what he writes about his good friend in 1987. This is on page 100. Whatever else you could say about Roy Cohn, his lawyer and his friend, whatever else you could say about Roy, he was very tough. Sometimes I think that next to loyalty, toughness was the most important thing in the world to him. For example, all Roy's friends knew he was gay, and if you saw him socially, he was invariably with some very good-looking young man. But Roy never talked about it. He just didn't like the image. He felt that to the average person, being gay was almost synonymous with being a wimp. That was the last thing he wanted to project. So he almost went overboard to avoid it. If the subject of gay rights came up, Roy was always the first one to speak out against them. Tough as he was, Roy always had a lot of friends, and I'm not embarrassed to say I was one. He was a truly loyal guy. It was a matter of honor with him, and because he was also very smart, he was a great guy to have on your side. You could count on him to go to bat for you. So here we have, in 1987, Trump acknowledging a good friend of his was gay. You know, that's great. That's fantastic if you're progressive and and you have no problems with homosexuals. But fundies, you do. Yet you haven't taken the time to actually read up about this man, about the trade imbalance with Japan on page 188. What's unfortunate is that for decades now, they, Japan, have been wealthier in large measure by screwing the United States with self-serving trade policy that our political leaders have never been able to fully understand or counteract. Trump's rationalization of gambling on page 197. Of course, he had casinos, folks, Christians. It certainly seems worth checking out. I've never had a great moral problem with gambling because most of the objections seem hypocritical to me. The New York Stock Exchange happens to be the biggest casino in the world. The only thing that makes it different from the average casino is that the players dress in blue pinstripe suits and carry leather briefcases. If you allow people to gamble in the stock market, where more money is made and lost than all of the casinos of the world put together, I see nothing terribly different about permitting people to bet on black, jack, or craps, or roulette. Folks, I have no problem with gambling. I have no problem with drinking. As far as other people, I don't drink myself. I have no problem with drinking. I have no problem with homosexuals. Yet fundamentalists say they do. But they are by far supporting this man. Throughout this book and his business practices, Trump brags about the fact that he doesn't have to answer to anyone. George Washington was against the office of presidency because he felt it was too much like a king and we're about to elect a new king. This is Shindo. Stay tuned for my next video about the heavy metal prophecy about Trump.